So it looks like we have a pretty good representation as far as people that have done ETL frameworks and those that have not. So there may be some of you guys that could deliver this presentation as well as I can, but we'll do the best we can. So the focus of today is actually going to be on building an ETL framework specifically for SSIS 2012. We'll talk generally, and let me see if I can get my presentation. We'll jump back to that. We'll talk at a high level about framework, some of the rationalizations for taking the time to build a framework, discuss some of the common parts and pieces to a enterprise ETL framework, and then I'll walk through a demo of a framework that I actually built so that you can kind of get a feel for some of the things that go into actually building an ETL framework. Before we do that, let me go back here and let me just introduce myself for those of you who haven't heard me speak before. My name is Chris Price. I'm a senior BI consultant with PragmaticWorks. I have my email up here. Feel free to shoot me an email with any questions. I also have all the materials from this session already posted on my blog, so I'll have a link for both the slide deck and the demo project available at the end of the session. So what is an ETL framework, or what is a framework more generally? If you come from a developer background, the frameworks are probably fairly common to you. So when we say framework, what we're referring to is a set of common reusable tools, processes, and procedures. And really the reason why we talk about frameworks is because we don't want to do repetitive work. So things like logging, configuration, any of those types of activities that are very repetitive, you don't want to spend your time and cycles actually building that into every single package or into every single project that you're working on. So again, why bother? Why take the time? Because there is an investment of time when you talk about an ETL framework. The big one is that you can standardize what you're doing. So I can standardize the way I'm doing my logging. I can standardize configuration. The worst thing in the world is if you have a bunch of packages and they're all doing logging different ways, maybe some between text files, some in the database, and so forth. So by having a framework that takes care of a lot of that, it abstracts that complexity out of the package development. So it simplifies your development, it speeds it up. And I only have about 20 slides here, so we'll get through these pretty quick. So the question is build, buy, or both. Obviously, PragmaticWorks, we have BI Express, which will do some of the ETL framework stuff for you. It will instrument your packages and take care of some of that for you. There are plenty of examples of ETL frameworks to be found that are for free. You can get those over at Codeplex or on various places around the internet. So those, I group both of those into the buy option, even though you can certainly do the open source for free. The consideration when you take that route is it's basically a one-size-fits-all. So if you're going to use those, they're typically plug-and-play unless you're going to take some work to modify them. The build option is the exact opposite of that. So if you're in a situation where neither one of those are going to fit your needs, whether it be because of business requirements or maybe compliance issues that you have to address in your ETL, or if your ETL just has a high level of complexity, then it may not be an option. You may be forced to build your ETL framework. Typically what we see is that it's a hybrid. So you can certainly take advantage of tools like BI Express. You can start with a open source framework and tweak it to your needs, but ultimately you're going to wind up still doing some build, at least a minimal amount of building to get something that's useful. So the rest of this presentation's we're just going to assume that we're actually going to build the framework. And before we do that, we need to at least have a level of understanding of how we're going to implement a framework within SSIS. So this slide is particular to the parts and pieces of SSIS that we're actually going to use to build the framework. The biggest part to this is event handlers. So if you're new to SSIS, some of this stuff may sound new to you. So I definitely invite you to check out some of the other sessions we have that cover SSIS and the topics in there, because these are important, particularly when you start building your framework. So every package has event handlers that are fired at various points of the life cycle of a package. So things like prior to execution, which would be the pre-execute and post-execute. We actually get a on-change event if we configure a variable to fire the on-change event. We get event handlers fired for errors, warnings, and information, and so forth. So we can actually hook into those events to actually build our own framework. Typically, when you do hook into these events is when you're going to do fully custom logging. So if you don't want to use the built-in logging, you'll typically have to instrument each one of those event handlers to do the logging. We're going to take advantage of the built-in logging, and the example I show will actually give you the option to do both. You can use the SSIS logging that was in prior versions, 2008 and prior, and it's still available in 2012. You can also use the logging that goes on in the SSIS catalog. You'll see I do both because the SSIS catalog is only available when the project's actually deployed to the server. So if you're running a package from SQL Server Data Tools, then none of that logging will actually occur for you. We'll talk about configuration. You can certainly use built-in configuration, and that's very common. Parameters are new in 2012, and they're a form of configuration or a replacement for configuration, and you'll see how those work as well. And then finally, the project deployment model. So the project deployment model changes a lot. We have, for the first time, a true notion of a project. So we can do things like locate and execute child packages in a much different way than we did in prior versions, where we needed a flat file connection or a connection to a database to do that. So all these are, and this isn't an extensive list, but this is enough to get you going as far as what you need to be familiar with within SSIS to get going. So when we talk about the various parts and pieces to a framework, there's a bunch of different parts and pieces that are moving. And the nice thing about framework is it's basically you can implement what you need. And what I typically recommend is that you implement exactly what you need and that you don't try to over-engineer it. The problem is you can get into rabbit holes with some of these things that you may not find your way back up from. So some of the common parts and pieces are things like logging and auditing. We need to know what the package did and if it errored, why it errored, and so forth. We need a way to handle configurations so that as we, for example, migrate a package from dev to QA to prod, that we can easily change the configuration of the package so that we're not having to actually update the package in any way. We need a way to do notifications, and we'll talk about that more on a subsequent slide. We need to be able to handle things like fault tolerance and recoverability. What's going to happen in our ETL framework when something does go wrong? And it will go wrong at some point, whether it be data or design or whatever the case may be. How do we handle orchestration and parallelism? If we have dependencies, so if our extract package has to run before our load package, how do we handle that? Scheduling, do we handle scheduling at all? A lot of times this is something that people punt on and use SQL Agent for. I'll show you just my version of how I handle scheduling so that I can completely do it within SSIS and not rely on a SQL Agent schedule. And then obviously the most important, once you build all that, is how do I do reporting and monitoring? How do I get data out of the ETL framework so that I know exactly what's going on within the framework? So let's just get a little bit deeper into each one of these before we look at it at an example. For logging, you have a couple different options. You have the built-in logging. That's the logging that you're probably familiar with that was available in versions prior to 2012, logging to a text file, logging to the SSIS log table if you're doing SQL Server logging. And then there's also the catalog logging. So when I deploy to the catalog, there's an SSIS DB that is actually going to do a lot of the same logging for me. So we have a couple options there. That kind of logging helps us out with when did a process start and finish, was the process successful, why did the process fail, gives us high-level error messages and stuff like that. When we talk about auditing, that's where we get into things like doing data lineage. So we want to know what records were inserted into our data warehouse or to our ODS by what processes. We want to know for each package how many rows were loaded. So how many rows came from the source versus were inserted, updated, or deleted, and so forth. Configuration. Configuration is, again, in prior versions you had options like loading configuration from XML files, from SQL Server, and there's obviously some other configuration options that are available as far as environmental variables and registry entries and so forth. But the big one here is parameters. So parameters is huge, and it simplifies managing packages and doing configurations. Notifications. How are we going to do our notifications? So this is an important topic. So are we going to do notifications to event logs? And this is actually what I recommend if your organization has some sort of monitoring built into place, whether it's Operations Manager or NetIQ. Typically those are bubbled up into a notification framework, so that's the best way to go if you have those tools available. Logging to a database table, and then having that table tied to either a dashboard or report. The thing that most people say they're going to do is email, and I'm not a big fan of email. Like most of you guys, I'm sure you guys get a ton of email, and it's very difficult to keep up with, and it's very easy to overlook that important email that comes in. Typically, it's just not a very good way to go, and I'm sure you guys can understand that if you get any volume of email. But you have to decide that when you're implementing your framework. You have to decide what way am I going to do notifications out of my framework, and then I need to make them configurable so that I can actually turn them on and off. Fault tolerance and recoverability. A lot of when we talk about fault tolerance and recoverability, a lot of that is in package design. So while we can certainly do restartability and handling errors to some degree in our framework, and we'll actually build that into our framework, a lot of what we need to do to make that even more robust is in how we design our packages. Things like using transactions if a transaction is appropriate, and understanding how transactions behave in SSIS, because they don't behave quite as cleanly in SSIS as they do in SQL Server, particularly when you're working with a connection manager. So there's some additional configurations that you have to do to make that work. You have to design your packages to be restartable. Just building a package doesn't make it restartable. So you have to understand with how data is changing, are resources available? If something goes wrong, do I need to do some cleanup so that the package is runnable a second time, and so forth. You can use checkpoints to do this. The demo I have doesn't use checkpoints, but there is a built-in feature in the SSIS that uses checkpoints. What checkpoints do is basically allow you to start your package again. Any of the tasks that completed previously will not be run a second time. So that may be a good option for you if that's something you're trying to accomplish. Orchestration and doing work in parallel. Orchestration, when I refer to orchestration, what I'm primarily referring to is package precedence. So if I have some sort of constraint that package A needs to run before package B, and so forth. So if we're building an enterprise ETL framework, we need to be able to handle that so that we can basically give all the packages to the framework, and it can actually sort out through metadata what packages need to be run in what order. And then obviously doing things in parallel. One of the things that SSIS does very well is actually processing data in parallel, or doing work in parallel. So we don't want to hinder that. We actually want to take advantage of that so that we can do work more efficiently and not sequence everything so that we're basically making a single threaded framework. The final two here are scheduling. Scheduling is, again, one of those things most people actually just rely on SQL Server Agent, and there's nothing wrong with that at all by any means. I've got an example that basically mimics the scheduling in SQL Server Agent, so it's got a lot of the same options as far as being able to define a schedule, whether it runs once an hour, once a day, and so forth, and then all that's calculated within SSIS, and it'll take care of running that for you, which some of this will make more sense once we once we get our feet wet in the demo. And then the final is reporting. When we talk about reports, you need to be able to report on things like configurations of your packages, actual executions of the packages. What were the performance? What's the trend of the performance? Is this package that loads our customer, is it getting slower over time? Is it getting faster over time, which typically doesn't happen, but maybe it does, and so forth. So we definitely need to know that kind of information if we're going to monitor and be proactive in managing our ETL. We certainly need errors. So when something inevitably goes bump in the night, we need to be able to figure out why it happened and troubleshoot it and get it running again if for any reason it didn't run. Dashboards are actually are kind of one of those things that you may or may not work with. A dashboard is very useful in an ETL framework. It just gives you that quick, at-a-glance status of what's going on. Is everything kind of humming along? Is there issues I need to address and so forth without having to drill too deep into reports? So with that, let's talk about designing a framework. And again, this design is specific to the one I built, so your mileage may vary. Some of the complexity you may not need. So again, this is just for demo purposes. The way I started this framework is the first part is you have to have some sort of repository, and typically this is going to be a database of some sort. So your database, your framework repository is going to store all the metadata that's specific to your framework. So things like information about your packages, if there's any precedents or dependencies between your packages, any scheduling information, any notification information, and so forth. It's also going to store configuration information. So you can store that actually in the repository. You can certainly split that out into its own database if you wanted to split that out into its own database. And the same goes for logging. The sample I built, again, this is demo, I put all of it in a single database. If you're doing this in a production scenario, you may want to split your logs out specifically to a separate database so that you can manage that database independently of your framework repository. Once we have our repository, we're actually going to build a set of packages, and we'll look at the packages, I believe, on the next slide. And the packages are what's going to actually handle doing all the notifications, any the recovery or orchestration, doing things in parallel, and actually doing scheduling. The last thing that you'll need once you actually have your framework packages is you'll want to develop template packages from which all your actual ETL packages will inherit. Those template packages are where you're going to actually implement all your logging, any auditing that takes place, configurations, handling any fault tolerance if you're doing anything that requires updating information in your framework that the packages failed and needs to be retried and so forth. So with that, let's actually look at some packages here. I've got a slide here that talks about the different packages, but rather than looking at that, we're going to look at the actual packages within the project. All right. So this is the project, and again, this project, I have this already out on my blog, and I've got a link at the last slide that you can go out and download this project. You can download this project. It's got, in the miscellaneous folder I point out, I've got the database script so that you can actually run that script and get all the tables that you need. You'll notice that specific to SSIS 2012, we have the notion of a shared connection manager. Unlike prior versions where we had connection managers, and we can certainly use them in packages, they didn't function as a true shared connection manager. So we have now with 2012 the ability that I can specify these project level connections that only need to be configured once. So once I deploy this to the SSIS catalog, I'll have the ability to manage these connections without doing anything like setting up an environment variable and then loading the configuration from the database. So you'll see I've got 4 connections defined here. One connection is actually going to my ETL framework. One connection I'm using for my logging database, and then one connection I'm actually doing for configurations if I was doing SQL Server configurations. The AdventureWorks is just so that I had data flowing, so that would be the equivalent of something your source system or destination, whatever the case may be. So let's talk through the various parts. I'm going to start with the application. So the structure, and we're going to show the database first before we get into this. So the database, there's actually not a whole lot to this. The database structure is the application is the top level container within my ETL framework. So the application is basically nothing more than a collection of tasks. The collection of tasks are actually nothing more than SSIS packages that I've wrapped some metadata around as far as how they behave. So things like what I can actually assign them to a parallel channel if I'm running multiple channels in parallel. I can specify an execution order, or if there's any precedent constraints. I can make the package so that it runs out of process or asynchronously. I also define things like what happens when a failure occurs, and that's what you see there with that failure action code. So if this package fails, does the application continue running, or do I need to actually abort the application and terminate the processing? I also, for each task, define what the recovery action is. So is this a task that can be restarted? And the framework will actually handle that based on that configuration. If the package fails the next time it's run, it'll either retry it or skip it. So if I show you what the data looks like within these tables just briefly, you'll see again the application at a high level, there's not a lot here. So I just give it a name, and this is a friendly name for reports, so that when I'm actually building reports around this, I'm not having to look at any crazy names. Recovery action code, I can actually make the application at a container level, whether that's recovery or not, and that'll basically override all the task configurations. So if I have something that's touching sensitive data, or that could be particularly dangerous, and I don't want to be worried about somebody adding a task that could do something bad, I can actually override that at the application level. I can turn parallelism on and off at the application level. So when obviously that's a bit field that's either a 1 or a 0, I can actually disable doing things in parallel. Very useful for debugging. It's very difficult to debug in parallel when you've got multiple things going on at the same time. So if you run into a critical issue and you need to throttle that back and force everything to run in a single channel, you can actually turn that off so that it'll just run on a single thread. I can also specify the number of parallel channels. So you'll see how that's implemented shortly. When we look at the task and the way the tasks are configured, each task is basically just a package. I can actually assign it to which channel I want to run. If I don't, it'll take care of that for me. If there's any precedents, and so forth. So fairly lightweight as far as the metadata goes. When we look at this within the project here, and I'm going to start with the application. This is again is the top level container, and I've got these channels hard coded for this demo. So you'll notice that I've got 4 channels here. Let's see if I can move this over a little bit. So the flow is very simple within my application. The first thing that it does is it does a safety check. So I had a requirement that each application can only I can only have one instance of each application running at a time. So the first thing that it does is prevent the application from firing twice. So it'll actually check the database to make sure that. It does some initialization startup that it goes in and configures everything. In the database, I'm actually storing the execution instances so that I can track exactly what was executed at the application and task level. And all that is it's almost identical to the other tables as far as tracking failure and recovery code, so that if somebody were to go in there and change it, we know exactly how that application or task was actually executed. So that's all done in the pre-flight. And then this is where we actually get our doing things in parallel. So we're actually going to do 4 channels at this point in parallel. You can make this dynamic so that I'm actually just using 4 for each or 4 loop iterator to create as many channels as I need. I hard-coded this just to make it a little bit more visual. And then obviously once the application is complete, we need to close the application. And I actually am doing some application scheduling so that once the application finishes, it'll actually update the application schedule for me and prepare for the next run. All right. So that's the application. Each one of these channels is actually spawning what I call a task factory. And all the task factory does is it's responsible for executing the task. So the task factory is actually the next class here. And all it's doing is actually making sure that this channel is enabled. So if I'm doing multiple channels or multiple threads, it'll actually run this task factory. If I've throttled it down to a single thread, then it basically just disables the channel so that it doesn't try to do any work. It gets a collection of all the tasks, and then it's just going to loop through the collection of tasks. So that it's fairly straightforward as far as what this package does. When this task is actually fired, most of the work of the framework is actually done in the task. So the task, the first thing that it does is, again, we have to handle precedents or dependencies. So it'll actually check to see if its precedents are either actively running or haven't run. If there's a package that has a precedence that has not run, it'll actually wait on that package to run before executing. Once that package has successfully executed, it'll actually do the work that it needs to do down here. If for any reason that precedent fails, then it'll actually log that failure, and the task will be indicated as a failure because of a precedence. So the task will actually handle all that. We actually use event handlers within this task, primarily the pre and post execute, and all that's responsible for doing is starting and ending the task. We actually want to know within this framework how much time is spent waiting on precedence, because that can be a configuration issue. So I'm actually, as soon as prior to this package executing, I'm starting the task, and I'm actually logging the completion as soon as the task finishes, because I want to know if this step here is actually slowing my process down. If I have things too spread out on too many threads, I can actually slow things down instead of getting a performance gain. So this is, again, what this is doing is once the precedents are satisfied, it gets the task information. It'll actually execute this task by assigning it the package name. Currently, this framework is built entirely for SSIS 2012, so it's using the project reference. I point this out because it's actually would be very easy to make this more dynamic so that it can use an external reference as well. And again, all of these properties and parameters you see are actually could be set by expressions. So it's just a matter of making that data available within the framework. And I've done that already with the execute out of process just to show you a demo that I can actually force this execute package task to execute out of process. You could do the same way for external references and then assigning connections if you needed to be able to execute packages that resided on the file system or were in a SQL Server instance. We handle all of our failures so that we never, in theory, our application task factory and tasks should never fail. So if our child package does fail, it'll actually handle that failure, and then based on the failure action that's configured, it'll either abort the application or continue on processing. I have a template package. The template package, again, just some best practices stuff. I've went ahead and put some placeholder annotations in here. I like grouping my annotations together so that I can minimize them and get them out of the way if I've got a complex package. Most of what this template package does is it's a collection of variables. So in this case, I've defined my working variables. I also have my parameters. So things like, is SSIS logging enabled? And this is the older SSIS logging, so I can basically turn on and off SQL Server or text logging. Is the framework enabled? So one of the things that I don't want to do is I don't want to tie these packages to have to run in the framework. So I want to be able to run these outside of the framework. So I actually put a flag on within the template that I can disable all the framework features and not have any issues. I actually am using a heartbeat within the framework because I allow things to run asynchronously. So I want to actually use the on progress event. I actually throttle that. I don't want to get that heartbeat every single time the on progress fires. So some of that logic is built in here as well. And then the key here is this task execution ID. We're going to pass that to each one of our packages so that it has the ability to update the framework database. And that's primarily done through the event handlers again. So the event handler, the last thing it's going to do is it's going to log any rows, and those are being logged in the variables that we see. So as long as you're using those variables, it'll take care of auditing those row counts for you. The pre-execute does some initialization and so forth as far as starting the task. The other thing that we need to do, which I haven't talked very much about, is actually setting the package execution ID. So in order to tie our executions within this framework to the logging that's built within SSIS, we need the package execution ID, which is it's an integer, or it's an integer in the SSIS catalog, and it's actually a unique identifier in the prior version of the log. So you have to have that to be able to tie back to the logs that are being generated out of SSIS for you. And just little things like the on variable change. So I can actually configure this to log my variable changes so that when I come in to my template, and let's do this in one of my demo packages. These demo packages are just copies of the template where I'm doing something. In this case, I'm moving data. If I needed a variable log that was important, I can actually come here and go to variables and say important variable. And I'm just going to leave it in it. And now to make this so that it's going to fire, by default in SSIS, if you're not familiar, variables do not fire the change event. So I have to actually tell this variable that it needs to fire that change event. And that's actually in the properties. This raise change event, I'm going to set that to true. So that's actually anytime this variable changes now, it's going to fire that change event, and the framework's going to take care of logging that for me. So it's very, very easy to work with. So the last piece to talk about, and I don't want to put a lot of emphasis on this because a lot of people just don't go to this level, is the application scheduler. So the application scheduler, all I've done here is it basically initializes the application schedule. I've done all the work in stored procedures so that I don't have a lot of the complexity built into an SSIS package. So it's based on the application schedules that are configured within the database. It's going to calculate the next run date or if there's anything that needs to be run for me. And that's all done in this configuration config.application schedule database. And we have schedules here, which is, again, very similar to what you would see in the SQL agent as far as having frequency type and interval, subdate type and interval, relative interval, and so forth. If I needed to block it off on a start and end time, which would be if I only want to run during business hours or so forth. So again, a lot of this, you can do the same exact thing with SQL agent, and it will have far more functionality than what this solution has. So obviously SQL agent's a very robust tool and would be very difficult to mimic that on your own without a good amount of development effort. But I have that built in for the sample for those of you that are interested. So if I actually kick this off, and I'm going to just start this in design mode now so that we can see what happens. And you're going to see packages flash all over the place as it kicks off. Oh, you know what? I made a rookie mistake here, and I clicked the play button and not actually executing the package. So I have multiple solutions, or multiple projects in my solution, and clicking play does not work. So I need to actually click execute package. And you'll see it's going to flash through. It's going to run the different task. I actually have a dependency set up on item number 3 that it's actually going to wait, so you'll see it tick over here shortly. It actually waited on number 1 to finish before it run, so it's actually running here. And we can see what's going on within the database here. I'm going to switch back over while that's running. And just within the database, I'm actually going to just select the top 1,000 rows for this. So we can actually see what's going on. The ones that are relevant are execution ID 3 here. And you can see that a lot of this is metadata that's just stored for auditability, so we know that what it looked like when the package was run. Over here to the right, we see things like when was it started. We can see the status updates. That's the heartbeat that's fired for us so that we can actually keep track if we have a long-running process or something that's running asynchronously. Package execution IDs, task package. This is the framework package. This is the child packages that are actually executed. You'll notice here that I'm not storing the SSIS execution ID, which is an integer. The execution ID is a container ID, so I stored that on the application. It's not specific to the task. And then obviously we get our row counts here. So this one hadn't finished yet when I executed this query. If I execute that now, it should have finished. So we're actually tracking all that with very, very little work from a development effort. I'm going to jump back over to my project here. I've gotten some basic reports developed, and I included those in the download as well. Against the framework database. So I have the ability to do some drill into that I can actually see. This is at the application level. My application's demo app, the last time it was run. Its next scheduled run time, which is not right. It was last run successfully, and it wasn't forced stopped. I can actually drill in and see all the executions if I had multiple executions. And then I could drill into that specific execution and see the status of each one as well as row counts and so forth. Now, I didn't tie this to the SSIS catalog, and I didn't want to have to distribute any third-party projects. But I want to point out that there's very robust logging going on within the catalog. So I'm going to bring back up Management Studio here, and we're going to focus on the Integration Services catalog. Within the catalog, you obviously have some built-in reports, and if you're familiar with 2012, you've probably seen some of this already. So you've got the ability to view the built-in reports. I can actually drill into some of these. There's some different views here as far as what I can see. You'll notice that this ID is the SSIS execution ID is 2. You'll notice that it's actually encompassing all my packages here. So I don't get different IDs for each package execution. It's the actual execution. It's a container that's going to store everything. And so I could actually scroll through, see every single task that executed within my project here, and it's going to help me scroll a little bit. Or get back to the top. I can view any messages that occurred. If there were any, I don't think there's any messages there. Or these are event messages, so I can actually see everything that happened. So very robust logging going on. If it's not enough logging, you can certainly still roll your own. You would have the framework there, so you have the ability to do that. Now, the reason I didn't tie this to my reporting services report is I'm actually want to call your attention to Jamie Thompson's project out on Codeplex, which is a set of reports that he developed on top of the catalog. And I've imported it into my project here. It's not in the project that you'll download. But he's actually gone through and written some fairly robust reports that'll give you data within the SSIS catalog. So we have the ability to actually drill in here, and if I drill into executions, you'll see I can get the execution times and so forth. And there's a bunch of different reports in here. This isn't obviously, shrink this. This isn't obviously about that, but I want to point it out. It's free. It's out on Codeplex, and it saves you some time writing these kind of reports that are useful for monitoring your ETL framework. The last thing I want to point out is throughout all this, I've been doing the logging that exists in prior versions as well. So if I go to my ETL framework database, I'm using the SSIS log as well. So if you already have a bunch of reports for an existing framework built around that, you certainly can still make use of that. And you're still getting all that data. Now, this execution ID, I'm actually still pulling that into my task tables so that I have the ability to join against that and actually see what it's doing. And the cue here that only my template packages are the only ones that are running that logging. So you'll see that the source is only doesn't involve any of the application or task or so forth. So very easy to mix and match. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't have to be rigid. You can tailor it to whatever your needs are. So let's jump back over here and then we'll open it up for questions. So these are the parts and pieces.
Yes, we do have a few questions, Chris, if you have a moment.
Okay, I've got one more slide and then we'll open it up for questions.
Perfect.
So then what's next? Some of the things that I didn't talk about today, which can be very useful in an enterprise ETL framework. Doing things like metadata-driven ETL. So if I have a bunch of tables that I'm moving data from point A to point B with no transformation, it's very easy for me to automate that and do some dynamic package generation. I can actually do a lot more with asynchronous package execution. I could do a lot more with parallel channel balancing. So if I am going to run multiple channels, I want to be able to balance that so that I don't basically overwork a single channel, so that I could balance the load out. Things like doing scale out, the worker pile pattern. So there's a bunch more that once you get into this and get comfortable, there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down. And as long as the business need is there, then the SSIS, particularly SSIS 2012, is the ideal platform for implementing it. And with that, we'll open it up with questions. I've got the link here to my blog on the resource page. You can actually go out now and download both the PowerPoint as well as the zipped solution. So with that, we can open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Jimmy wants a little bit of clarification. He got a little confused. What is the order of inheritance in your framework? Applications are made of tasks, tasks are made of packages?
Yep, exactly. So applications are the top level container. It's strictly a logical container that groups together what I refer to as task. A task is basically a package. So I split task from packages because the first iteration of this framework, I had packages that could be run in a couple different contexts. So a task is basically a configured package.
Okay, perfect. Edwin would like to know, some of the data could be extracted from the SSIS DB database. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. So all the data is we tie to that within the ETL framework. When you're building your framework, you certainly want to tie to that execution ID so that you can link your executions within the catalog to whatever you're storing within your ETL framework.
Okay. Rick would like to know, is the database script for the ETL information in the resources list?
It's actually within the Visual Studio project. It's included as in the miscellaneous folder.
Ah, perfect. Michelle would like you to give an example regarding why you'd want to use SSIS Scheduler rather than SQL Agent Schedule.
When I first built this framework and first did this, this was actually, framework was originally 2008, and I've upgraded it to 2012. When I originally built the framework, I built it in an organization that didn't use SQL Agent, so it just wasn't available. Now, realistically, I know probably 99% of the people use SQL Agent, so I left it in there because I did all the work to make it actually work. But again, it's not required within this framework. You can actually execute the packages independent of the scheduler. Execute the applications independent of the scheduler, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Joseph would like to know, what is the maximum number of packages you can run in parallel to archive ultimate results?
That's in typical consultant fashion. It depends question. It depends on the server that you're running your SSIS packages on. So there's a maximum degrees of parallelism setting within SSIS, and I believe it's set to the number of cores of your processor plus one. Okay. So there's only a limited amount, based on whatever server you're running on, there's only a limited amount of threads that are available.
Okay, and here's another question. How can you split the error logs from a package to a file table email?
Split the errors?
The error logs from a package to a file or a table or an email. The error logs.
I mean, it would basically be when an error occurs, you could certainly write out to wherever you wanted to write it out. If you handle the on error event, that's going to give you that control to log that error. Whether you don't have to log it to a database, you can certainly send an email or write it to the file system. I'm not sure if I fully understand the question.
Okay, if you want to just clarify in the questions panel, I'll go ahead and ask it again. Jessica would like to know, do you still have the 2008 versions of the ETL framework available?
Yep, I actually have the 2008 version of the ETL framework is available out on CodePlex, and I can provide that link. I believe if you just search for Enterprise ETL framework, it should come up out on CodePlex.
Perfect. Most ETL process involves loading data files. I'm not really sure I understand this question. Let me try and read it again. Most ETL process involves loading data files and when it appears, kind of a file watcher. Is there any support in SSIS 2012 to do this?
You have to build that support. So it's possible to build in the same way. If you look at the task, and I'm gonna jump back over here for a second to answer that question. If you look at the task package, you have to build it. There's no built-in component that'll do that for you. But that's essentially what this container does. Is it's basically a for loop that is just waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to change. And you would basically do the same thing. You would check the file system repetitively to see if that file showed up, and then you would actually execute. So you can build that within SSIS. There's nothing built in that would do that for you.
Okay, perfect. The next question is, do I understand that you are listing the packages in SQL Server and running them based on a list in SQL Server?
Correct. Correct. So you'll notice that there's no master package per se here. If you're familiar with having to build these master packages where you're building all your orchestration into that master package, the way I've implemented this framework is there's no need to actually build those master packages. You're actually going to build all that through metadata, and using the metadata, it's going to accomplish the same exact thing as that master package. This is far more flexible, particularly if you have large implementations and there's still active development going on, than having to keep that master package up to date.
Okay. The next question is, where on your site is the framework project for downloading?
It's on this resource link.
Okay.
Let me see if I can. Maybe. See if it'll let me do it in play mode. Nope. Well, let me just copy it, and I'll bring it up and show you guys where it's at. If you want to ask the next question while I'm doing that.
Sure. What is the difference between an application and a task?
The application is just a container of task. So all it is a logical container of multiple tasks.
Okay, perfect. This is a long question, so bear with me.
Okay.
We currently use SSIS SQL Server 2008 R2, and we'll move to 2012 soon. A problem we are experiencing is when our SSIS package data source file is a flat file on a share file and is run from SQL Server agent job, the job never finishes and is unkillable processes and is left hanging in the system. Is this a known bug, or do you know of a way to fix this?
I don't have an answer for that one. I'm not sure if it's a known bug or I haven't had a similar issue, and I've worked with clients that load a lot of flat files through SQL agent jobs, and I haven't seen that behavior.
Yeah, that's weird. What I can recommend to you with this issue is we have an offering here at Pragmaticworks called Virtual Mentoring Time, and we could get a consultant, to remotely assist you work through this if that's something you'd like. You can email me at you have my email address from the GoToMeeting invitation, so if you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me. And our last question is, what are these things called heartbeat?
Right, so heartbeats, the framework is currently set up to allow packages to execute asynchronously. The problem with executing packages asynchronously is there's no method of callback or anything like that. So it's basically the heartbeat is the on progress event within the package, and basically during that on progress event, I'm basically just updating a timestamp so that I know the package is still actively running. So if I have a package that executes for 45 minutes, I don't want to fire that asynchronously and just lose sight of it till it completes. I want to be able to know that it's still working, and that's what the heartbeat does. Now I've throttled that. I don't want my framework to be too chatty with the framework database, because obviously everything that you implement within the framework is going to slow your package execution down to some degree. So I've overridden that, and I've made it configurable so that I've got it set that it doesn't send the heartbeat more than once a minute. But you can certainly tweak that to whatever your needs are.
Right.